The stars stretched across the vast dark sky like a never-ending sea of lights. A sleek spaceship glided through the emptiness of space, its engine humming low and steady. Inside the ship, Captain Lyra stood by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the universe. She was an alien, a commander of the Zorethian fleet, known for capturing the most elusive creatures across galaxies. But today, something was different. Today, she was looking for something, or rather someone. Her mission was simple: find and capture a rare species from Earth. The Zorethian Empire had gathered specimens from many worlds, but Earth had always been a mystery. The humans were primitive but strong, and Captain Lyra had heard rumors that there was something special about them. Something that intrigued her deeply. "Captain, we have located the planet," her second-in-command, Vrax, said, stepping into the room. His voice was calm, but there was excitement in his eyes. He knew Lyra's reputation. If she was after something, she would catch it, no matter what. Lyra didn't reply immediately. Her mind was already working, calculating the best way to approach this unknown planet. She had seen humans in recordings before, fragile creatures compared to her kind, but there was something about them. They were unpredictable, and that made them interesting. "Bring us into orbit," she commanded. "Prepare the extraction team. I want this one alive." Vrax nodded and left, giving the orders to his crew. Lyra felt the ship shift as it entered Earth's orbit. She could feel the pull of the planet's gravity, the unknown challenges it would bring. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready. Down on Earth, a young man named Jake was going about his day, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He was working on his small farm, just outside a quiet village. It was a simple life. Nothing fancy, just the daily grind. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and looked up, squinting against the sun. A strange sound filled the air, faint but growing louder. He frowned, hearing something unusual. His heart skipped a beat as he looked toward the sky. At first, he thought it was just a plane. But then it grew louder, too loud, too fast. Before he could react, a strange ship appeared in the sky, dark and silent. It hovered for a moment, and then a beam of light shot down from the ship, pulling him up into the air. His body felt weightless, and he couldn't scream, couldn't even move. The world around him spun as he was lifted higher, higher than any human should ever be. And then everything went black. When Jake regained consciousness, he found himself in a cold, metallic room. He blinked, confused, his mind racing. Where was he? What had happened? He tried to move, but his body felt heavy. His hands were restrained, held against the cold floor. His heart raced, and panic set in. A door slid open with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped inside. She was tall, taller than any human woman he'd ever seen. Her skin was a deep shade of green, and her eyes were bright, glowing with an intensity he had never experienced before. She wore a uniform, the kind of uniform a soldier would wear, and there was no mistaking the power in her stance. She looked down at him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "You're awake," she said in a smooth, calm voice. "Good. I was beginning to wonder if I'd overdone it." Jake's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a croak. He swallowed, forcing his voice to work. Who are you? Where am I? What is this place?" The alien captain tilted her head, as if considering his words carefully. "You are aboard the ship of Captain Lyra of the Zorethian fleet, and you, Earthling, are now my prisoner." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. A prisoner. This couldn't be real. He must have hit his head, or maybe he was dreaming. But the cold floor beneath him felt too real. And the woman, no, the alien, standing before him was too real. "What do you want with me?" he asked, his voice shaky. Lyra smiled, but it was a cold smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm here to study your species. You are a rare find, Earthling. My mission is simple: I take you, learn about your people, and bring you back to my empire as a specimen. Nothing more. Jake felt a chill run through him. He was nothing more than an object to her, a specimen to be studied. He didn't know how to react, but anger started to boil inside him. He wasn't some animal to be caged. Let me go, Jake demanded, pulling against his restraints. I don't care who you are. You can't just take me. Lyra's eyes narrowed. She took a step closer, crouching down so that her face was inches from his. I think you will find, Earthling, that you have very little say in the matter. You are mine now. Jake's heart skipped a beat. There was no escaping her, no escaping this ship, but something inside him refused to give up. He wasn't going to let this alien woman control him. He didn't know how, but he would find a way out. Lyra stood up, turning her back to him. Vrax, she called, and the door slid open. Prepare him for the next phase. We will begin the analysis soon. As the door closed behind her, Jake was left alone with his thoughts. He didn't know how he would escape or what was coming next, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. He had no idea what kind of alien world he had been thrown into, but he wasn't going to let it break him, not without a fight. The first meeting. Jake woke up to find himself in a small, cold room. His mind was still foggy from the strange way he had been taken from Earth, but the reality of his situation hit him like a wave. He was on some alien spaceship, trapped and surrounded by creatures from a world he couldn't even imagine. His hands were still tied to a metal chair. The light from the ship's ceiling flickered above him, casting long shadows. He had no idea where he was or what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing: he had to find a way out. The door to his cell suddenly slid open with a soft hiss. Jake stiffened, his body tensing. The last time the door opened, it was the tall alien woman who had taken him. He didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. Slowly, he looked up. And there she was, Captain Lyra. She stood in the doorway, her dark green skin glowing faintly in the light, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart race. Her uniform was sharp, military-like, and it gave her an air of power. She was tall, almost towering over him. Her presence filled the room, demanding attention without a single word. Jake couldn't help but notice the way she moved. There was something graceful about her, like a predator who knew she was in control. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't just coldness, it was curiosity. Good, Lyra said, her voice smooth and calm, but with an edge to it. You're awake. Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice rough from fear and confusion. Lyra stepped into the room, the door sliding shut behind her with another soft hiss. I've already told you, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're my prisoner, Earthling. I've captured you for a reason. Jake tried to pull against the restraints holding him to the chair, but they were too tight. He couldn't move much, but he wouldn't give up. He wasn't going to just sit there and let this alien woman treat him like a specimen. Why Earth? Jake asked, his voice shaky but determined. Why take me? I'm just a normal guy. Lyra tilted her head slightly, considering his question. Your species is not normal, Earthling. You are strong. You are resilient. You survive. You fight. You are fascinating. Jake stared at her in confusion. He didn't understand. So, you just take people from their homes because you think we're interesting. The alien captain's lips curled into a slight smile. It's not just about taking. It's about learning. I want to understand your kind, your planet. I want to know what makes you tick. Jake shook his head. This is insane. I didn't sign up for this. Lyra moved closer, her steps silent as she approached him. You don't have to sign up for anything. You are here now, and you will stay here until I learn everything I need to know. Her gaze softened just for a moment, and Jake caught a glimpse of something else in her eyes. It wasn't the cold, emotionless look from before. There was something else there, something like curiosity, maybe even a hint of something else he couldn't put his finger on. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the fear crawling up his spine. "And what happens if I don't cooperate?" he asked, his tone a little defiant. Lyra's smile faded. She leaned in closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I think you will cooperate. You don't have much of a choice, Earthling." Jake glared at her. "You don't scare me." Lyra's gaze lingered for a moment longer, and then she straightened up, taking a step back. There was something unsettling about her silence, like she was trying to figure him out, testing him in some way. After a long pause, she spoke again, this time softer. "I'm not here to hurt you, Earthling. I'm not like the others. You'll see that soon enough." Jake's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her. She was an alien, a captor, and he was a prisoner. There was no way he could trust her. But something in the way she said it, something in her voice, made him wonder. Was she really that different from the others, or was she just playing a game? "I don't need your sympathy," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she seemed to study him, her eyes tracing his every move, her expression unreadable. Jake couldn't help but feel like she was trying to figure him out, trying to understand him in a way that felt strange and uncomfortable. "You may not need it," she finally said, her voice calm. "But you'll find that things are different here. The way we do things, the way we think, it's all very different from what you're used to." Jake didn't know what she meant by that, but he didn't have time to ask. She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing softly in the small room. She paused before leaving, her back still to him. "You'll have time to think about it," she said over her shoulder. "But remember, Earthling, I'm not the enemy. Not yet." And with that, she stepped out of the room, the door closing behind her with a soft hiss. Jake was left alone again, his mind racing with questions. Was she telling the truth? Was there more to her than just the cold captor he had seen before? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. And somehow he couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get a lot more complicated. Getting closer. The days blurred together for Jake as he remained locked in the small, cold room aboard the alien ship. Every time he thought he might have a chance to escape, the door would slide open, and Captain Lyra would be there, her presence as commanding as ever. He couldn't get used to it. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Strong, mysterious, and strangely fascinating. At first, he resisted her attempts to talk, trying to push her away with cold words and stubborn silence. But it didn't seem to matter. She always came back, never losing her calm composure, never getting angry, and somehow, always making him feel like he was the one who needed to prove something. Over the past few days, he'd noticed something strange. Lyra seemed to be watching him more closely. Not in the cold, scientific way she had before, but with a kind of interest that made Jake uncomfortable. It was as if she was trying to figure him out, but at the same time, she seemed like she wanted to understand him in a way he couldn't understand. It was early in the morning, or what he thought was morning. The soft hum of the ship was the only sound in the quiet room. Jake sat against the wall, staring out at the strange, glowing stars through the small window. He didn't know where they were headed, or if they were even close to his home. His heart ached with the thought of Earth, of his family and friends. He wondered if they even knew he was gone. The door slid open, breaking his thoughts. He looked up to see Lyra step into the room, her long, dark green hair flowing behind her like a river. Her sharp uniform made her look even more intimidating, but Jake had begun to notice the subtle softness in her features. She didn't look so fierce all the time. "Earthling," she said, her voice calm as usual. "How are you feeling today?" Jake frowned, not sure how to respond. How was he supposed to feel when he was locked away in a strange alien ship, unable to leave? But instead of answering with anger, he sighed and leaned back against the wall. "I don't know," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I miss home." Lyra didn't respond right away. She simply stepped closer, her sharp eyes studying him. There was no judgment in her gaze, just a quiet understanding that made Jake uneasy. Why did she care? What was it about him that made her keep coming back? "Home," Lyra repeated softly. "I can see why that would be difficult for you, but you must understand, Earthling, that you are far from home now. You must adapt." Jake looked up at her, confusion filling his mind. "Adapt? How am I supposed to do that when I don't even know where I am?" Lyra paused, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite read. She took another step closer, her presence overwhelming in a way that made Jake's heart beat a little faster. It was almost as if she didn't realize how close she was standing to him. "I know this is hard for you," she said, her voice softer than before. "But you are not alone in this. I will help you." Jake blinked. He wasn't sure if she was being serious. The alien captain, helping him. She had kept him locked away for days. What was she really after? What did she want from him? "I don't need your help," he said, trying to keep his voice firm. "I just need to go home." Lyra's expression softened, but only slightly. "I understand," she said quietly. "I can't promise you that you will return home, but I can promise you that I will take care of you, at least until we reach our destination." Jake was quiet, his mind racing. She wasn't exactly offering him freedom, but her words, they were different this time. It felt like she was trying to connect with him, not just keep him as a prisoner. It was strange, and it confused him even more. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly. "Why are you being nice to me?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. She stared at him, as if thinking over his question carefully. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took a step back, crossing her arms. There was a pause before she spoke again, her voice low and serious. "You are different," she said. "I have never met anyone like you, Earthling. I'm trying to understand you, trying to understand your kind." Jake shook his head, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. "I don't get it. You've been watching me for days, and you still don't get it." Lyra's expression was unreadable. "It's not just about understanding your behavior. I want to understand you as a person. I've spent my life fighting battles, commanding fleets, but you—" She stopped herself, and for a brief moment, her voice faltered. "You are something else." Jake didn't know what to make of that. Was she telling the truth? Did she really want to understand him? Or was this all part of some plan? He didn't know if he could trust her, but part of him, a small part, wanted to believe her. "You don't have to be like this," Jake said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't have to keep me here. I'm not a prisoner. I'm just a guy who wants to go home." Lyra seemed to consider his words, her gaze softening just a little more. For a brief moment, Jake could see something in her eyes, a glimpse of uncertainty, maybe even something like regret. But then she turned away, her face hardening once again. "Perhaps," she said, "but not yet, Earthling. Not yet." She stepped back toward the door, but before she left, she glanced over her shoulder at him. "We'll see each other again soon. You're not alone here." And with that, she was gone, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts. As the door slid shut behind her, he couldn't help but wonder, was there more to Captain Lyra than he thought? Or was she just another alien who saw him as a prize to be studied? Jake's pulse raced. This was the moment. He could feel the weight of her words, her presence. It was hard to breathe with the way she was looking at him, with the way she made him feel. He didn't know what this meant for them, for his future, but he knew one thing for sure. Things between him and Lyra had changed. As she slowly pulled back, she gave him a soft, almost sad smile. "I can't offer you freedom yet, Earthling," she said, her voice quiet. "But I will offer you something else." Jake looked at her, unsure of what she meant. "What is it?" Lyra paused, her eyes filled with emotion. "I will give you my trust. That is all I have to offer right now. But it's a start. Jake nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. He had never expected this, a strange bond forming between them in the most unlikely of places. But now he couldn't deny that it was happening. He didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time since his capture, he didn't feel so alone. The escape plan. Jake couldn't stop thinking about it. The feeling that something had to change. He couldn't stay on this alien ship forever. No matter how much his connection with Lyra was growing, the reality was clear. He was still a prisoner. A part of him understood that he had no choice but to find a way out. It wasn't that he wanted to leave her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he stayed much longer, the relationship between them would turn dangerous. He didn't know where it would go, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that their bond could never be fully accepted by her crew, by her people. He needed to be free, and Lyra needed to face the truth about their situation too. As the days passed, Jake started observing more carefully. He watched the ship, looking for weak points, places where security was light. It was hard to ignore the fact that this ship was huge. He had no idea how it worked, or what it looked like outside his room, but he was determined to find out. The escape had to be possible. One day, while Lyra was away on a mission, Jake finally found the courage to act. He had spent hours trying to understand the security system from his small room, looking for a way to slip through unnoticed. There were small vents near the ceiling, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear faint noises from the other parts of the ship. He had been waiting for the perfect moment, when the guards would be distracted, when Lyra would be too far away. The ship had guards patrolling the hallways, and he knew he couldn't outrun them. But if he could sneak out and find the control room, maybe he could make it to an escape pod. He had no idea how to fly the ship, but surely there was some kind of emergency escape plan. And if not, well, maybe he could just cause enough chaos to make his own escape. That morning, as Lyra left the ship to conduct an important mission, Jake knew this was his chance. He had spent the night preparing, finding small tools he could use to break into the vent system. It wasn't much, but it was something. His heart was racing as he stood up, carefully looking around the room. He took a deep breath. "I can do this," he whispered to himself. Carefully, he pried open the vent cover. The smell of stale air hit him as he crawled inside. He had no idea where the vents would lead, but it was better than staying where he was. He could hear the distant hum of the ship's engine, the soft sound of footsteps echoing in the hallways. It was now or never. Jake crawled through the narrow vent, his hands shaking with nervous energy. It wasn't easy to move quietly, but he tried to stay as silent as possible. His eyes scanned ahead, looking for any sign of movement or danger. There were occasional sounds of footsteps or voices, but nothing that seemed to threaten his escape, at least not yet. After what felt like hours, Jake reached a small opening that led into a storage room. He pushed the vent cover aside, feeling a sense of relief when it dropped silently to the floor. He was in a new part of the ship, but the real challenge had just begun. The control room had to be close, but how could he get there without being caught? He glanced around, noting the dark hallways, the dim lights overhead. He could hear the sound of a door sliding open down the hall, and he quickly pressed himself against the wall. He held his breath, trying to stay as still as possible. It was only a guard, one of the crew members walking by, completely unaware of Jake's presence. He waited until the footsteps faded away, then slowly moved in the opposite direction. His heart was pounding in his chest. Every sound, every movement, felt like it was echoing across the ship, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. Jake walked cautiously, careful to avoid being seen. He knew the control room wasn't far. It had to be near the center of the ship. But as he turned the corner, he froze. Lyra's voice echoed down the hallway, calm but firm. She was back. He had to hide, and fast. Without thinking, he ducked into the nearest room, quickly closing the door behind him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he pressed himself against the wall. trying to control his racing heart. He could hear Lyra's footsteps growing louder. She was close, and if she saw him, his plan would be over. The door to the room slid open, and Lyra walked in. Jake's pulse quickened as she paused, looking around as if she sensed something was wrong. She stopped for a moment, then glanced directly at the spot where he was hiding. Jake held his breath. But then, after a few long seconds, Lyra turned around and walked out of the room. She didn't see him. Jake exhaled slowly, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had almost been caught. The feeling of danger had never been so real. He knew his window of opportunity was closing. Lyra was back, and soon the ship would be on high alert. He couldn't waste any more time. He had to find the escape pod, and fast. He stepped out of the room, moving with caution. The ship felt more dangerous now. He didn't know how long he could stay hidden, but he had no choice but to keep moving forward. His escape plan had begun, but now it was a race against time. Would he make it, or would Lyra discover his plan before he could get away? Unexpected help. Jake's heart raced as he moved quietly through the dark corridors of the alien ship. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. He had barely avoided getting caught by Lyra, and now, with her back on board, he knew he was running out of time. He had to find an escape pod and leave before it was too late. But the ship seemed bigger than ever, and the hulls twisted and turned in ways that made him feel lost. His eyes darted nervously around, scanning for any sign of danger. The security systems were tight, and he couldn't afford to be caught. He had to move faster. As he walked, Jake couldn't stop thinking about Lyra. She had been kind to him. She had shown him a side of the aliens that was different from the cold, calculating soldiers he had seen before. But she was still an alien, and he was still a prisoner. He couldn't forget that. He rounded another corner and froze. A loud sound echoed through the hallways, the distinct noise of metal footsteps. It was a guard. Jake quickly ducked into a nearby room and shut the door behind him, his breath coming in quick bursts. He had to think fast. He listened as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The guard was heading right for him. Jake's heart beat harder in his chest. There was no time to run. His only option was to stay hidden and hope the guard didn't find him. Just as the door began to open, Jake pressed himself flat against the wall, holding his breath. The door slid open, and for a moment, he thought he was done for. The guard stood there, scanning the room, eyes sharp and focused. Jake's pulse thudded in his ears. But then something strange happened. The guard paused, sniffed the air, and then turned around without saying a word. He left the room as quickly as he had entered. Jake stood there, stunned. What just happened? How had the guard missed him? He didn't have time to figure it out. He moved quickly, leaving the room and slipping down the hall. He was more determined than ever to escape. But there was something else nagging at him now, something he couldn't shake. That guard's strange reaction. It wasn't normal. Had something changed? Or was he just lucky? As Jake continued, he realized he had reached a different part of the ship. The walls looked familiar, but the layout was different. It was quieter here, and the hallways were narrower. He had no idea where he was, but he was getting closer to his goal. Suddenly, he heard a soft voice. It was low and quiet, but unmistakable. Jake. He spun around, his hand instinctively going for the small knife he had taken from the storage room. But it wasn't a guard. It was Lyra. Jake froze. What was she doing here? He had expected her to be with the crew, not sneaking around the ship. He quickly pushed the knife back into his pocket and tried to hide the shock on his face. "Lyra, what are you doing here?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, her face serious. "I've been watching you, Jake," she said quietly. "I know you're planning to escape." Jake's stomach dropped. Had she been watching him this whole time? Had she known all along? I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice filled with confusion. I have to get out of here. You know that. Lyra's eyes softened. I know, but you don't have to do this alone. Jake blinked in surprise. What do you mean? I can help you, she said, taking a small device out of her pocket. It looked like a communicator of some kind. I've been working on a plan of my own. I want to get you out of here, Jake. I want you to be free. Jake's mind raced. Was she telling the truth? Could he trust her? A part of him wanted to believe her. The thought of leaving the ship, of being free, was so tempting, but he had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. I don't know if I can trust you, he said, his voice low. Lyra took a step closer, her expression softening. Jake, I've never been part of the ship's command. I've always wanted something different, and I've seen what they've done to you. I don't agree with it. You deserve better. Jake looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. He saw none. The sincerity in her gaze was impossible to ignore. Could she really be helping him? Are you sure you can get me out? He asked, his voice filled with doubt. I can, she said confidently. I've been gathering information. I know where the escape pods are. I know how to override the security systems, but we have to move fast. The longer we wait, the harder it will be. Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Okay, he said, his voice steady now. Let's do it. Lyra smiled, relief washing over her face. Follow me, she said, turning and leading him down the narrow hallways. As they walked, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of trust in her. She had helped him without hesitation, and now she was offering him a chance at freedom. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. They moved quickly, staying close to the walls and avoiding the patrolling guards. Lyra guided him through hidden passageways and maintenance halls, places that Jake would have never found on his own. Finally, they reached a small, hidden room. Lyra tapped a series of buttons on the wall, and a secret door slid open. We're almost there, she said, her voice low but filled with determination. Jake felt a surge of excitement. The escape was within reach. He couldn't believe it was happening. But as the door opened, they were met with a new challenge. A group of guards appeared at the far end of the hall, blocking their way. Jake's heart dropped. They were so close. Lyra looked at him, her face set with resolve. Stay close to me, she said. We can do this. And in that moment, Jake knew. He wasn't just escaping the ship. He was escaping with someone who cared about him. Someone who was risking everything to help him. The fight for freedom was just beginning. The decision. Jake's heart pounded as he and Lyra hid behind a set of large crates. The guards were getting closer. He could hear their heavy footsteps echo down the hallway, their voices low but urgent. They were searching for him. For them. It was now or never. Lyra squeezed Jake's hand. He could feel the warmth of her touch, the only comfort in this moment of chaos. She had helped him more than he could have imagined. And now she was risking everything to get him to safety. We need to move quickly, she whispered, her voice sharp but calm. Jake nodded. His mind was racing, but his body felt frozen. It wasn't just fear holding him back. It was the choice that was weighing on him, a choice he hadn't expected to face. Escape was within reach, but as much as he wanted to run, to leave this alien ship and never look back, there was something pulling him in a different direction. It was Lyra. She had been his ally since the very beginning. She had been kind, understanding, and brave. She had helped him when no one else would. And now she was giving him the chance to leave. But could he leave her behind? Jake's thoughts raced. He had been dreaming of freedom since the day he was captured. But now he was faced with a reality he hadn't imagined, one where he had to decide if leaving was the right thing to do. Lyra noticed the hesitation in his eyes. She turned to him, her expression soft but serious. Jake, what is it? We don't have much time. Jake swallowed hard. I don't know if I can leave you behind, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's eyes softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to slow. Jake, you deserve to be free. You deserve a life without fear, without this ship hanging over your head. She paused, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But I can't leave either. I'm with you in this. We'll get out together, or not at all. Her words cut through the noise in his head. The decision was no longer just about him. It was about them. About the bond they had formed in the most unexpected of circumstances. Jake looked into her eyes, seeing the truth of her words. Lyra was right. She had chosen him, just as he had chosen her. They were in this together. He couldn't leave her behind. Taking a deep breath, Jake stood up from behind the crates, feeling the weight of the moment. Then let's do it, he said, determination rising in his chest. We'll escape together. No turning back. Lyra smiled, a flicker of relief crossing her face. She reached for the device at her belt, tapping it quickly. A small panel on the wall slid open, revealing the narrow hallway. It led directly to the escape pods. We're almost there, she said, her voice steady now. Stay close, and don't make a sound. Jake nodded, following her down the narrow corridor. They moved quietly, their footsteps light but quick. Every turn, every corner, felt like a new test. They had to be careful, or they'd be caught. But they were so close. Freedom was just around the corner. As they neared the escape pods, the sound of voices grew louder. The guards were getting closer. Jake's heart thudded in his chest as they approached a junction. He could hear them talking, their voices echoing in the hall. Lyra paused, listening intently. She signaled for Jake to stay behind her. We have to go now, she whispered urgently. When I give the signal, run. Jake's mind was racing. They had no time left. If they didn't act now, they'd be trapped. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Okay, he whispered, his voice steady. I'm ready. Lyra gave a quick nod and tapped a series of buttons on her wrist communicator. The door to the escape pod room slid open with a soft hiss. It was empty. Go, she hissed. Without hesitation, Jake dashed through the door, his feet pounding on the metal floor. Lyra followed close behind. They'd reached the escape pods and Lyra immediately began working on the controls. Jake kept watch, his eyes scanning the hallway. He could hear the guards getting closer, their voices louder now. Time was running out. We're almost there, Lyra said, her fingers flying over the console. Just a few more seconds. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe they were this close. He could taste freedom on his lips. But then, something caught his eye. A figure stood at the end of the hall, watching them. It was one of the guards. Lyra, hurry, Jake shouted, his voice rising in panic. Lyra's eyes snapped to the figure, but she didn't hesitate. She quickly activated the escape pod, and the door to it slid open with a soft hum. Get in, she ordered. Jake didn't hesitate for a second. He ran into the pod, followed by Lyra. She slammed the door shut behind them, locking it with a swift movement. The pod lurched to life, the engines humming softly as they began to rise. Jake's breath came in ragged bursts. His eyes met Lyra's, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw something new in her eyes. It wasn't just determination anymore. There was relief, and maybe even something else, something that felt like hope. As the pod shot away from the ship, Jake looked back, watching the massive vessel shrink into the distance. It was behind him now. But there was still one final decision to make. Jake turned to Lyra, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. Where do we go from here? Lyra smiled softly. Wherever you want to go, Jake. And for the first time since his capture, Jake felt free. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to choose. Together.